Millennium Soldier Expendable for the PS1 is this turn of the Millennium running and gunning game that you play in the third person perspective. But really, it's more over the top. It's like an over the top game, kind of like Diablo games. It's good in some ways. For example, the CGI cutscenes in the game, or at least the one in the beginning, looks amazing. Like really great graphics in the CGI cutscenes. It looks like something out of the PS2, but it's a PS1 game. Granted, a later PS1 game, still a PS1 game. It's a game about shooting aliens and war and futuristic post-apocalyptic settings, but it's very tongue-in-cheek, as you can see by the cutscene. It's like a comedy type of game, or at least the story's comedy. Once you're actually in the gameplay, not really anything funny, just pure unadulterated shooting and combat. It would be technically a good game because it has a good premise. It takes place in this post-apocalyptic future. You're running around most of the time just forward or to the sides, shooting a bunch of things and destroying the environment. That's very important because you can destroy things in the environment. Almost everything in the environment is destructible. And also there's a lot of different weapons, so it's good to mix it up and, use different types of strategies and different weapons on different environments and different enemies. And the boss fights are more or less the same thing, trying different weapons and bosses to see what works better. The thing is, there's a lot of problems with the game, mostly in the controls. It's really hard to maneuver your character. Like when you go left or right, you run in a circle, but then you can also strafe left and right. And I feel like they should have just chosen to either use the directional buttons to move the character or to strafe left and right, but not both. When you use both, it's really clunky to control your character. You'll be running in a circle, and then when you strafe, you'll lose track of which way you're going because you're always moving from the perspective of the actual character. Like if your character goes left, you're gonna go left, regardless of where the character is facing. It's almost like it's always in first person, even though the game is not in first person. The character is not moving based on your perspective, but his perspective. It's almost not like controlling a character. It's like controlling a little remote controlled toy car. That's what I would equate it to. But the fact that there's also the strafe function makes you move left and right, and you can move it together subsequently with the directional buttons, it makes the movement that much more complicated. And then on top of all this, you're not always running from the bottom to the top. Sometimes you're running to the sides. Sometimes enemies are coming at you from all sides, so you can't just perpetually look up. You have to turn around, you have to strafe in different dimensions. The movement is all over the place. You have to move in 3 dimensions in this game, and it gets very confusing. Especially when you're being attacked from all sides, and especially when you're being shot at from all sides. On top of this, sometimes the game lags when there's a lot of things going on screen at once, and that's a really bad thing in a game like this because there's going to be a lot of times when a lot of things are going on in the screen all at once because you're always going to be bombarded with enemies, and then multiply that lag twice because on top of all the enemies running around, they're also shooting, and then you're shooting, so there's even more stuff going on screen. The game can just be really laggy, and then combined with the really confusing and bad movement controls, the game can just be straight up frustrating. The only saving grace here, something saving this game from being really bad, would be the great setting and the fact that you have a lot of cool weapons in the game. I feel like this game would have been a ton better if you simplified the game. Like, there's too much going on. The best thing to simplify the game would just be to simplify the controls. Instead of turning with the directional buttons and also strafing left and right like you're controlling a tank, choose one or the other. Just let the character strafe left and right, for example, and then don't have enemies coming out of all sides. Just have the enemies attacking you from the top, where you don't have to turn around, where you don't have to look in different directions. This would make the game a lot more palatable. It would make the game go down a lot smoother, just be a much better experience. A lot of times this game just feels like a clusterfuck because of the way you move. But how would it compare to other war-type games like this? Well, let's compare and contrast it to a few I've reviewed in the past, and I don't think we really have to go back too far. Let's take something like Metal Slug X. a game I reviewed like a week ago. It's not exactly like this. It's running and gunning, but it's not over the top. It's just 2D basically, running from the left to the right. But I can still compare it because it's running and gunning. You're soldiers. You have different weapons. It's very similar. I think the only difference is in this game you could get hit more than once before you die. Metal Slug is definitely harder, even though this game is harder when it shouldn't be harder. Um, Expendable is a game that gets hard because of the bad controls and because of the lag. Metal Slug is hard, but not because of bad broken elements in the gameplay. Metal Slug is hard because there's just a lot of hard enemies. There's a lot of things on screen, but Metal Slug handles really well. There's no lag. Metal Slug has great controls. So in almost every aspect, Metal Slug is better than this game, Millennium Soldier Expendable. In fact, I think Metal Slug 10X is better in pretty much every aspect. The graphics are better, even though it's 2D. The game doesn't lag at all. The characters control much better. Even the simple things you don't really think about, like shooting enemies. It's a lot more satisfying in Metal Slug to kill the enemies, mostly because they're like these big, thick, well-drawn characters, and they die in really cool ways. Overall, Metal Slug is just better in every single way than this game. I mean, this game, by all accounts, is an over-the-top version of Metal Slug, but it doesn't even hold a candle to Metal Slug. Now let's take another running soldier type game, Sniper Elite 3. This is a game I reviewed about 3 years ago, and it's nothing like this game, but it is a game where you play as a soldier. The thing is, in Sniper Elite 3, you focused more on sniping, but there were still aspects in that game where you just run and gunned, where you just ran forward and you had to shoot enemies with like an Uzi versus shooting them with a sniper. The controls and the shooting was a lot better in Sniper Elite 3, and I feel like the meat and potatoes of Sniper Elite 3, the fact that you can basically see an x-ray of the enemies you're shooting, you can see the bullet going inside the enemy soldiers you're shooting, you can see it in slow motion. It's like really gruesome, but it's really fascinating to see how you kill the person. It's like watching some kind of medical exam slash playing a game. I feel like the most important aspects of Sniper Elite 3, the X-ray sniping, blow this game again out of the water. I think this game might be a little more fun when it comes to just unadulterated havoc, where you get to explode everything in sight. That's definitely not something you typically do in Sniper Elite 3. It's a lot more reserved. But the fact that there's just a lot of lag when too many things are on screen, too many things are exploding, almost cancels that out for this game. So yeah, even Sniper Elite 3 is much better than this soldier game. The last running, gunning, soldier type game I want to compare to this one is Dynamite Duke. Now, Dynamite Duke is the only of the three games I'm comparing that actually came out before this game and for a much more weaker system. It was for the Sega Genesis. And Dynamite Duke is also a game where you don't really control your character. I mean, you can control your crosshair, but in that game it was a very much on rails shooter. So basically the screen moved by itself. You saw a third person perspective of Dynamite Duke as he shot enemies with different weapons. In that game there was also a destructible environment, so that was pretty cool. The graphics in this game obviously are a little better just because it's the PS1, but I feel like the combat and the shooting in Dynamite Duke was a lot better in this game. Mostly because, again, there was no lag in Dynamite Duke. There were no movement problems in Dynamite Duke, even though obviously you didn't control your character, you still controlled the crosshair, and there was no problems controlling the crosshair with your directional buttons in Dynamite Duke versus controlling your character in this game where it's nothing but problems. And even though Dynamite Duke doesn't seem like it, it's very similar to this game. It's running around as a soldier, just causing crazy havoc and killing everything in sight. While just on the outside, the games don't look similar, the premises of both these games are very similar if you think about it. But still, Dynamite Duke, just a lot better than this game. Again, mostly because it's not hampered down by technical problems. If this game didn't have bad movement controls, if there was no lag, it would probably be better or as good as Dynamite Duke, maybe even as good as Sniper Elite 3 and Metal Slug 10. As it stands right now, it's barely passable as an average run and gun over the top shooter. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more classic game reviews. Goodbye, my friends.